Hello again, students. I thought I would put together two short Zoom sessions for you to give you some background into psychology as a discipline. Because although we're launching straight into Erickson and then into all our cognitive theorists, I know many of you who have studied psychology before, who are very knowledgeable in this area, and it's wonderful that you are. But there are, of course, many of you who have not studied psychology before and therefore perhaps feel less knowledgeable about the area. So I just thought that it would be a good idea for us to do something about what psychology is all about and keep it very, very simple. So we're going to start off today by thinking about what the word psychology actually means. And if you think about the root words of this term or concept, the root words are psych, and the other root word is ology. And I'm quite sure from studying whatever subjects you've done at university, you know that the word ology means the study of. So it's obviously the study of something. So now we need to know, what does the word psych means? What are the roots of the word psych? And I just would like to give you a chance to think about that for a moment and just jot down on a piece of paper what you think the word psych actually means. Well, I'm not sure what you've come up with, but the word psych has been interpreted in various different ways. Certainly when the study of psychology began, it was interpreted by the Greeks as referring to something like the spirit or the soul. But it became associated over time with the mind. So in contemporary psychology, it is considered to be the study of the mind. And when we think of the mind, because it is an intangible part of ourselves, it doesn't have a physical space where it lives. It's something that pervades every part of us. We usually look at it in terms of it being the study of our mental processes, our thoughts and our emotions, and the mental processes that govern our behaviors as a result of that. So if you think about psychology in that way, perhaps it gives you a clearer idea what psychology is all about. So what I want to share with you in this Zoom recording is I want to just share a little bit about the origins of psychology and the early theories that we found in psychology as a starting point. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to start off by sharing a picture of the origins of psychology. So I'm assuming that you can see that picture, and we start off with the ancient Greeks. In 500 to 300 BC, people like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle started putting a more philosophical slant on this whole issue of what psychology was all about. And they had various different views, which I've just popped there very, very briefly. Knowing thyself and using thought and reason and experience with the world around us, quite different kinds of ideas, but still really all wrestling with this whole thought and idea from a philosophical point of view as to what psychology is all about. And then in other parts of the world, we got people like Confucius, who really believe that everybody has an inborn capacity to do good. And that's ultimately what people are like. And if they do bad things, it's because of the influence of various bad things in society. And then as time developed, certainly in the Western world, there seemed to be more of an influence of Christianity on the different thoughts around what psychology was about. And St. Augustine was one of the main people who put forward that approach. And he saw Christianity as a basis for psychology. So there was this huge, big effort, if you like, on the part of the Christian believers at that time to make inroads into the field of psychology. And then from the Middle Ages started the Age of Reason, where there was now starting to be a move away from Christianity, more into an age where people started thinking, no, we have to reason about this, we have to think logically about it. It cannot simply be something related on faith alone. And that was all at the time. So moving on then, comes the period of empiricism and rationalism. And this is where we have people like Francis Bacon and René Descartes. And Bacon, he believed in deductive reasoning. And so he was a great believer in empiricism, namely experimentation. So it is only really through experimentation that you can look at things like cause and effect, or you can consider those kinds of issues. And you need to go from the world that is known to you and try and find things that are unknown to you. So he was moving along that path and trying to push along that path in terms of the field of psychology. Whereas René Descartes believed very much in rationalism. And he said there were two views of man. Man is a physical being and man is a mental being. And we can explain everything in the physical realm because we can see it, and we can, have a look at it, and we can look at the human body and how it functions, and we can observe how it functions. But if we're doing that at a physical level, why can't we do that at a mental level as well? So can you see how these thoughts are starting to evolve over time? And then came a major point of a turning point, if you like, in the field of psychology. And that was where psychology started being viewed as a science. And the person who really started that was a man called Wilhelm Wundt, who in fact put together the first psychology laboratory. And he believed that you need to study psychology under certain conditions, and conditions which you can control. So you can see the effects of the controls that you put in on the human behavior and on what people tell you and what they share with you in terms of their emotions and in terms of their thinking. So I hope you can see that over the period from when it all started, it moved from a more philosophical realm into a more faith realm, and then into a more rational realm, and then finally into empiricism, and then establishing psychology as a science. And once psychology was accepted as a science, that is when things really started taking off in the field of psychology. So I'm going to stop sharing that for the moment, and I just want to know what you think about what we've spoken about so far. But it's quite interesting to see how people were interested in how people behave and how they think and feel right from the very beginning. And because they didn't have the necessary things around them that could assist them to do this, they started philosophizing about it. And that's how we developed over time, over many hundreds and hundreds of years, into establishing psychology as a science. So what I want to do now is have a look at the very early ideas in the field of psychology. So I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm going to move to a diagram, which I'm going to share with you. And I trust that you can see this diagram. And this diagram is a very simple summary. Honestly, it's very simplistic. For those of you who've studied psychology, you'll see we're flying through this at a rapid rate of knots. But one of the first people after this establishment of the psychology as a science was a man called Wilhelm Wundt. And Wilhelm Wundt and another man called Edward Titchener were the people who started the whole school of thought under structuralism. So just to keep it simple and tell you something about it, Wundt believed very much in introspection to study mental experiences. So people had to think about things deep down inside themselves and then express their thoughts. And when you get people to introspect, you can find out more about how they really think about things, and that can give you an insight into their mind and into their psyche, if you like. And he believed also in breaking down mental experiences into component parts. So if we can understand those component parts, we can understand more about how people think and feel. Then Wundt and Titchener together worked on trying to create something like a periodic table of the elements of consciousness. So just like you have a periodic table in chemistry, they were trying to apply the same idea to the field of psychology. As we said, breaking it up into its little component parts, hence the term structuralism, to find out the structures of the human mind, identify them, and then put it all into a table. I don't know how they ever think they would have been able to do that, because the human mind is capable of so many things. And we know today how the human mind develops and changes and matures over time. So anyway, that was what they were aiming at doing. After their time came a man called William James, and he in the mid 1800s and 1900s was actually wanted to put forward a totally different view to the structuralism view. And he said, no, we've got to focus on the functions of the psychological processes, because how our behavior and mental processes help us to adapt to the demands we face is what we need to be looking at. We're human beings at the end of the day, and how we're going to behave and think depends to a large extent on our environment. And we need to behave in certain ways that are going to help us to survive and help us to cope. So in a sense, you could say, yes, it was the birth of functionalism, but it also started laying down the foundation of behaviorism. Now, if you're getting all these words that you haven't heard of before, you read a little bit more about it, I think it would make a bit more sense. But I hope you can see that behaviorism and functionalism are related, and you might understand that more with the next part of this diagram. A man called John B. Watson came along, and he is regarded as the founder of the behaviorist school of thinking. He believed in studying overt, observable behavior as can, in terms of we can observe it, and we can also record it. And we can't really make any we can't formulate any results. We can't really make any conclusions on the basis of things that we can't actually study in a very, very rational way. So he was a great believer in the role of the environment in shaping the behavior of human beings. And he actually said that you can take any human being, and he believed you can mold that human being into anything that you wanted, which in a way is quite a scary thought if we leave children in the hands of the wrong kind of people. But at the same time, children who live in very loving, caring families can be molded into very loving, caring people. Well, that is what he believed in, and I think there certainly is some truth in the matter when we think about it today. But also at the same time came along a man known as B.F. Skinner, who studied how reward and punishment shaped behavior. So he believed very much in, yes, it's fine and well talking about the environment that has an effect on shaping our behavior. Yes, it does, but it depends how that environment shapes our behavior. So if, for example, we are indulging in behaviors which society thinks are unacceptable, then we need to punish that behavior. And we need to then try and get the behavior to change, because, it's not right and it's not appropriate and it's not acceptable. But at the same time, when we see behaviors that we think are really very acceptable and are positive behaviors, then we would want to reward those kinds of behaviors. And a lot of how people work with children works in this kind of way. And perhaps it works with us as adults as well, that when we want to reinforce something, we actually reward it. And we might actually show a very much different kind of stance when we see behaviors that we don't like. So this really was the true beginnings of behaviorism as a major, major force in psychology, known in some of the psychology books as behaviorism or force number 1. So I'm going to stop and share that particular diagram. And I hope you can see where we're heading now. So we've moved from the scientific laboratory stance And we've continued along that kind of way of thinking and talking about experimentation and then talking about how the behavior shapes the environment and so forth. So what I want to do now is move on to the next part of that diagram to show you what happened from that time onwards. So I'm going to share this now, and I hope you can see that. In this diagram now, moving on, we're talking about a man called Max Wertheimer and Gestalt psychology. He was well known in the 1800s to 1900s. And he did further study in line with structuralism and perception. So he then went back. So can you see how sometimes what happens, you're going off in one direction, someone comes along and says, no, 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 you're going too much into the extreme that way, we've got to do it this direction. So after structuralism, you got functionalism, and then you got behaviorism. And then Max Wertheimer came along and said, no, 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 we need to go back to the structuralist way of thinking. There definitely is something in that is a good way of studying the mental capacities of human thinking and of the mind. So he believed that when we see things, we perceive things as wholes and we see things as patterns and not parts. So he got this idea, in fact, by looking out of a train when it was traveling really fast through the German forests. And when you're traveling very, very fast in a train, you don't see the individual trees. You just see a whole series of like a mixture of colors, and it's a very different kind of shape. And there are many gestalts, and I could show you some images which are actually quite fun and interesting, where if you look at a picture in one way, you see this, but if you look at a picture in another way, you actually see that, you see something else. But we don't have time to go into it now, and I just wanted to show you that that was the next person, main person who came along in the field of psychology. So this, in fact, further developed this idea of structuralism. But then along came a man called Franz Brentano, and he was the first person who looked at psychology as a human science. And that was from the 1800s, and certainly this is something that we find in psychology very much today. He believed that individuals have a human will. We're not just victims, in a sense, of our environment, but we actually do have the ingrained capacity to make our own choices as human beings, and we can actually have the will to make things happen for ourselves. We can institute change in our lives. So that was really the beginning of humanism, which eventually became Force 3, and which we'll talk about a bit more in a moment. But soon after Brentano came another man, and I think many of you have heard of him, and his name was Sigmund Freud. And he started this whole school or idea of psychoanalysis. And he was in the late 1800s, and even today, with the neo-Freudians, or the people who came after Freud, many of Freud's ideas are still followed today in the field of psychology. But he believed that behavior is determined by unconscious forces that are within the person. So inside every person, there are these various needs and impulses, if you like, that determine the way in which we behave. And that is the main thing that determines our behavior. It does not come from the environment. It actually comes from inside us. It's something inherent in us. It's been there for years and years and generations way back. It already started. And he also believed very strongly that early childhood experiences are very crucial in shaping our personalities. So I'm going to show you the picture of a diagram just now when I do my next PowerPoint with you in my next short Zoom session. But the picture of the iceberg shows you very clearly what he saw as the conscious and the unconscious. The conscious being that part of us which we are consciously aware of, which we can speak about. I think so and so, I feel so and so. I'm fully aware of what's going on in my thought processes at the moment. But at the same time, we have the unconscious, which are things we push back into a part of our minds that we don't want to deal with at that time. And that is what he referred to as the unconscious. the picture of the iceberg showing that the unconscious is a very, very large part of ourselves because it's the iceberg hidden underneath the water, which we'll have a look at in a moment. So this was the beginning of the psychodynamic perspective, which became force 2. So I'm going to stop sharing that slide with you now. And I know you watched the video with the I find him rather a funny presenter, and he's quite fun. And unfortunately, he does speak rather fast in the video, but I hope that through what I have spoken to you about today, you've learned something more about the beginnings of psychology and can have a better understanding of where we're going within this field of psychology. Please note, this is not something you need to know in great detail for this particular module, but I think it really is good to have as a background, especially for those of you who have maybe a very limited background in this field of study. So I'll see you in a moment in the next video.